A grieving veteran and his loyal dog uncover the buried truth. Sergeant Elijah Reed was erased and hidden beneath an old oak, along with files proving a decades-long cover-up. But Max wouldn't leave the tree. Jack chose defiance, and with Sarah Klein's help, the box became a fuse. Names were named, hearings opened, and peace came from the truth. Now hear the shocking twist of this drama and why justice, in the end, prevailed. The forest didn't make much noise this time of year. Just the whisper of wind slipping through tall Kentucky pines, the occasional creak of branches too old for their weight, and the shuffle of leaves under quiet paws. It was exactly what Jack Coleman had come for: silence, or at least something close enough. After 30 years of military service and the recent passing of his wife, Jack had chosen solitude the way a man chooses a final post, not out of desire, but necessity. He purchased a modest log cabin deep in the woods, far from highways, far from people, and miles from anything resembling noise. Just him, the trees, and Max. Max wasn't just a dog, he was family. A golden retriever with sharp instincts and softer eyes, Max had served 2 tours beside Jack overseas. He'd been there when shrapnel tore through Jack's right leg, and again when Jack awoke weeks later with silence in one ear and a mind full of static. Max had waited, just waited, like dogs do when they understand that healing takes time. For a while, the rhythm of their life in the woods had felt steady. Coffee at dawn, long, slow walks, chopping wood that Jack barely needed but insisted on stacking anyway. Some days they didn't speak at all. Other days, Jack rambled about the past like Max was his old CO, nodding and listening. Then something changed. It started with Max's gaze, focused, fixed, on a crooked tree about 20 yards behind the cabin. An old oak, gnarled and thick with rot, one of hundreds like it. But Max was obsessed with it. The first day, Jack noticed his dog pacing around it, nose low to the ground. The second, Max refused to come when called, whining and pawing at the roots. By the third morning, Jack found him digging, not playfully, not like a dog after a squirrel, but with precision, claws furiously scooping at the dirt like something needed to be uncovered. Jack had dismissed it at first, probably a raccoon den, maybe a buried bone from months ago. But Max wasn't some backyard mutt chasing shadows. He was trained to detect explosives, identify chemicals, even locate bodies. His instincts were sharp and rarely wrong. Still, Jack had tried to wave it off. He didn't want to be pulled into something, not again. "You're getting old and paranoid, mutt," he muttered, but he kept watching. The way Max growled at the base of that tree, it wasn't random. It was warning. That afternoon, thunder began to roll across the hills. The wind picked up. Leaves swirled around the clearing as the sky dimmed to the color of bruises. Jack sat on the porch, hand curled around a chipped mug, watching Max, still at the tree, soaked now, barking into the storm. He sighed, rising with effort. His right leg ached like it always did when the weather turned. He grabbed the shovel leaning near the door and stepped off the porch. "You win, soldier," he said under his breath. "Let's see what's got your hackles up." Jack approached the oak as Max backed away, tail stiff, eyes locked on the same patch of disturbed soil. Jack pressed the tip of the shovel into the earth. It was softer than usual, rain had loosened it, but something felt wrong. The soil was sunken, slightly, like it had settled, or like something was hidden beneath it. He dug, slowly at first, then with more force. The sound of metal scraping against wood echoed dully between lightning cracks. The ground gave way easier than he expected. Max stood motionless behind him, ears low, nose twitching. 5 inches down, the shovel hit something hard. Not stone, not roots, not earth. Metal. Jack froze. He dropped to one knee, brushing away the mud with his bare hands. The shape revealed itself slowly, rectangular, edged in rust, and unmistakably military. An ammo box. He stared at it for a long moment, heart beating not with fear, but with something older, something he thought he'd buried long ago. And then he whispered, almost to himself, "What the hell did you just find, boy?" The metal was cold beneath Jack's fingertips, even through the soaked fabric of his gloves. Time had eaten at its edges, leaving patches of rust like old wounds, but the box was sealed tight, as if it had been waiting. He stared at it for a moment longer as thunder rolled far above the treetops. Max stood behind him, still and alert, ears low. The forest had gone strangely quiet. With a grunt, Jack heaved the box out of the shallow earth. It wasn't heavy, but something about its weight felt unnatural, as if it carried more than metal inside. He set it gently on the ground, knelt beside it, and ran his hands along the hinges. There was no lock, just a corroded latch stiff from years underground. He hesitated. Then, exhaling slowly, Jack pulled it open. A wave of damp, musty air escaped. Inside, wrapped in what was once an olive-green military poncho, were unmistakable shapes. Bones, small, brittle, discolored with time. A human jaw, fragments of ribs, fingers, all packed tightly as if someone had done their best to conceal and contain them. Resting on top, nestled in folds of fabric, was a rusted dog tag. Jack's blood ran cold. He picked it up with trembling fingers and turned it over. Reed, Elijah A., S.G., U.S. Army, O-Paz, Protestant, SSN redacted. Jack felt the world tilt. That name wasn't just familiar, it was burned into his memory. Sergeant Elijah Reed had vanished during a high-risk Black Ops mission in northern Iraq, nearly 2 decades ago. A mission Jack had been on. At the time, the official word was missing in action. No body recovered, no trace. Command wrote it off as a disappearance during enemy engagement. But Jack had always had doubts. The operation had been chaotic, orders unclear, movements rushed, radio silence broken by last-minute redirections. And then Reed was simply gone. Jack's fingers brushed something else in the box. A sealed envelope. Yellowed with age, but intact. A faded red stamp across its surface read, "Confidential, eyes only, Pentagon internal." For a long moment, Jack couldn't move. His breath came shallow, like his lungs had forgotten how to draw air. Carefully, he peeled the envelope open. Inside, a set of grainy black and white photographs. Surveillance shots. A series of aerial images, and then ground-level stills. Blurred, but clear enough to show uniformed soldiers walking through what looked like a remote village. Then came the documents. Typewritten, faded, and marked with classified across the top margins. Some were reports, others were transcripts of intercepted communications. All of it meticulously recorded, and together they told a story Jack was not prepared to read. It wasn't the enemy they were watching in those images. It was their own men. The reports outlined a covert squad's involvement in a civilian cleansing, an unsanctioned act carried out under the guise of anti-insurgent activity. And Sergeant Elijah Reed had discovered it. He'd photographed it, collected statements. He was preparing to go outside the chain of command to report the incident through independent military counsel. But then he vanished. One final page caught Jack's eye. A short memo dated just days before Reed's disappearance. It was an internal directive, sparse in wording but crystal clear in implication. Subject: Reed Elijah A. Status: threat to operational integrity. Directive: field neutralization authorized. Justification: national security. Jack's vision blurred at the edges. He felt as if the air around him had thickened, pressing in on his chest. The phrase repeated in his mind: field neutralization authorized. The words sounded clinical, clean,
But Jack knew what they meant. Elijah Reed wasn't lost in the fog of war. He had been silenced. And Jack had been there. He had been part of that unit, followed those orders. He remembered the sudden reroute, the push to move through a ridge instead of the original valley. Reed wasn't with them. They were told he'd taken a separate position. No further updates, no search. He never questioned it. Jack sat back, mud seeping into the knees of his pants, the box still open before him. Rain tapped lightly on the leaves above. Somewhere, far off, an owl called. He looked down at the brittle bones, at the name on the dog tag, at the truth in his hands. And he whispered, as if trying to ask the question out loud would make it more bearable. "Did I help cover this up?" Max whimpered softly beside him. Jack placed a hand on the dog's head, grounding himself in the warmth and loyalty of the only companion who'd never betrayed him. He didn't have all the answers, not yet, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.
The wind had quieted. The rain tapered off into a fine mist, clinging to the leaves and Jack's clothes like cold sweat. But Jack didn't notice the chill. He was staring at the documents again, each line carving deeper into him like a slow blade. The pages weren't just words anymore. They were a mirror, a reflection of decisions he hadn't known he was making, and consequences he couldn't take back. It wasn't just that Sergeant Elijah Reed had been silenced. It was that someone had ordered it, someone Jack had trusted. As he flipped through the pages once more, details began to align, painfully, clearly. The communications logs, the change in troop movement, the rerouted flight plan, Reed's last recorded location, all signed off not by rogue soldiers or fringe operators, but by high-ranking officers Jack had once spoken to by first name. Brigadier General Travers, Colonel Denton, and worst of all, Captain Ross Maddox. Maddox had been Jack's direct commanding officer, a mentor, a leader who never raised his voice, never lost control, and who once told Jack over coffee, "The truth matters more than politics, always." Apparently, not always. A memory surfaced like a body from deep water. That night, 20 years ago, the night everything changed, Jack had been leading a recon team north of Fallujah. The orders had come in fast, a sudden change of course. "We're moving east now. Command wants a new position." No explanation, no brief. Jack remembered how Maddox's voice had crackled over the comms, low and curt. "Don't ask questions, just move." Jack didn't ask. He'd followed. That was what soldiers did. Another image hit him, a short conversation over the radio, muffled by static. Someone had asked, "What about Reed?" Silence. Then a different voice had replied, "He's been reassigned. We move without him." At the time, it hadn't seemed strange. Reed had always worked independently. He was sharp, curious, sometimes too bold. Jack had admired him for that, his unwillingness to look the other way. But in war, people vanished. Things went unsaid. Now Jack realized that was the point. It had been meant to go unsaid. He rubbed a hand down his face, pausing at his chin, like he could hold the weight of what he now understood. His fingers trembled. Max sat beside him, close, unmoving. The dog's amber eyes held a quiet awareness, as if he could feel every tremor in Jack's body. His tail didn't wag. He didn't shift. He simply watched, like a sentry standing guard over a soul unraveling. "I trusted them," Jack said aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper. The documents didn't accuse Jack of anything directly. He hadn't written the orders. He hadn't pulled the trigger. But he'd moved when they said move. He'd accepted the silence around Reed's disappearance because the mission demanded focus. Because leadership had told him it was nothing. Because he hadn't wanted to believe anything worse.
But belief no longer mattered. Not with a body buried under the roots of a tree behind his cabin. Not with Elijah Reed's dog tag sitting in his palm. And yet, as the truth settled on his shoulders, another thought gnawed at the edge of Jack's mind. What else had been buried? How many times had trust been traded for convenience? How many lives rewritten with a stroke of a pen? He looked again at the box, the old Weddell casing, the bones beneath a poncho, a man's silence wrapped and hidden, not by time, but by design. It wasn't just guilt Jack felt, it was complicity. He hadn't meant to be part of a cover-up, he hadn't known. But now that he did know, he couldn't pretend it wasn't his burden to carry. Max gave a soft whine and nudged his hand, grounding him again. Jack blinked. The weight in his chest didn't lift, but something else stirred. Not resolution, not yet, but the seed of it. If they had buried the truth once, it was his turn to unearth it.
Jack didn't sleep that night. He stayed at the window, watching the woods. The documents were spread across the table like a puzzle he'd already solved and couldn't unsee. Max sat at the door, alert and quiet, as if he too knew the air had shifted. By morning, Jack had made his decision. He couldn't carry this alone. He reached for a number he hadn't dialed in years, Sarah Klein, an investigative journalist in Washington, D.C., with a reputation for being as relentless as she was principled. Years ago, she had exposed a defense contractor scandal that had nearly cost her everything. She didn't scare easy. When she answered, Jack didn't waste time. "I have something," he said. "Documents, real ones. It involves names you'd recognize. It goes back 2 decades." A pause. "How big?" she asked. Jack looked at the rusted box, at Elijah Reed's dog tag resting on his palm. "Big enough to burn people to the ground." Another pause. Then, "Text me your address. I'm coming." Jack didn't say more. He didn't mention the remains. He didn't mention the envelope or the directive marked field neutralization. Not yet. Some truths had to be shown, not told. What followed were 2 of the longest days of Jack's life. It started subtly, a knock at the door with no one standing there. The hum of a drone overhead just after midnight. Then his landline cut out, followed by the internet. The next evening, he noticed the power flicker. Once, twice, then cut entirely. The generator failed to start. Max growled at something in the woods. That night, a black SUV parked at the tree line. It didn't approach, just sat there, lights off, engine idling for an hour before vanishing down the hill without a sound. Jack didn't panic. He'd expected this. He knew how systems like these worked, not with direct threats, but with pressure, intimidation, silence. But he'd also prepared. The documents were scanned and stored on multiple encrypted USBs, one of which he'd already mailed out under a different name. Another sat inside a hollowed book on his shelf. Cameras were placed around the cabin, low profile, motion triggered, streaming to a satellite storage service Sarah herself had once recommended. They wanted to scare him into silence. But Jack Coleman had spent too many years taking orders. This time, he had nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. Sarah arrived just before sunrise on the 3rd day, driving a dusty Subaru with Virginia plates and coffee stains on the dashboard. She stepped out in boots, windbreaker, and a press badge tucked into her satchel, though Jack knew she hadn't used that badge in years. She didn't smile, didn't offer pleasantries. She just said, "Show me." Inside, Jack laid everything out. The ammo box, the decayed poncho, the photos, the dog tag, and the envelope stamped Pentagon Internal. He spoke little as Sarah read. Her expression changed with each page. Disbelief, then tightening focus, then quiet, controlled rage. "Elijah Reed," she murmured, holding the dog tag. "They wiped him clean. He doesn't exist in any post-op logs. He's not even on the memorial wall." "That's why I dug him up," Jack said, "because they buried more than just a man."
Sarah sat back in her chair. "This is a federal bombshell. They'll fight it tooth and nail." "Then hit them before they can prepare," Jack said. "Go public. Don't wait for a green light." She nodded once. "I will." 3 weeks later, the world exploded. The story dropped on a Thursday morning. Sarah had published it on her independent site first, then pushed it to larger outlets once it began gaining traction. The headline was simple, chilling. "Veteran uncovers 20-year cover-up. Whistleblower silenced by military chain of command." Within hours, it was trending. By evening, major networks were covering it. By the end of the week, it was global. Names were named, documents were verified. The classified memo authorizing Elijah Reed's termination sparked outrage in veteran communities and civil rights circles alike. Congressional committees launched inquiries. Retired generals received subpoenas. A Pentagon spokesperson issued a brief, carefully worded statement calling the situation deeply troubling. But Jack didn't watch the news. He sat on his porch with Max, listening to the wind. The same woods that once held silence now carried echoes of something louder, the sound of truth refusing to stay buried. He didn't feel triumphant, not yet, but he wasn't afraid anymore.
Morning light filtered through the branches as if the forest itself had decided to speak softly. The old oak stood quieter now, its bark still scarred by roots and weather and the weight of everything it had been forced to hold. Jack Coleman faced it with Max at his side, one hand resting on the dog's collar, the other on a simple brass plaque anchored into the soil. "Sergeant Elijah Reed, truth never dies." The words looked smaller in person than they had in Jack's head, but maybe that was fitting. Elijah had never chased headlines. He had chased what was right, even when it cost him everything. Reporters had come and gone over the past few weeks, and they had angled for a hero to crown. Jack had kept his answer the same: the real hero's under this tree. No matter how many times he said it, the sentence still stiffened his throat. If there was any spotlight to be had, it belonged to a man who refused to let silence stand, and to the dog who wouldn't let a tree be just a tree. A breeze slid through the clearing and lifted a corner of the small American flag tucked near the plaque. Jack had debated whether to place it there at all. He knew symbols could be complicated things. But this wasn't about institutions anymore. It was about a promise between one soldier and another that truth once found would not be abandoned. He'd learned that promise mattered more than orders. Across the yard, Sarah Klein stood near the porch steps, a backpack at her feet and a notebook under her arm. She'd driven back down from D.C. on her own dime, not because the story needed more quotes, but because she wanted to be present for the moment this place turned from a crime scene into a memorial. She raised a hand in a quiet greeting when Jack looked over. He nodded back. No words were needed. Max pressed his nose into Jack's palm, insistently gentle. Jack smiled despite the weight of the day. "You always knew, huh, buddy?" he murmured, the old edge of gratitude in his voice. Max's tail thumped once against his leg. It had been weeks since the first dig, and the dog's vigilance had shifted. Where there had been agitation, now there was guardianship. He lay near the plaque when Jack worked outside, patrolled the clearing at dusk, and rested by the porch, as if keeping watch not just over the cabin, but over what the cabin now represented. Some things had changed in the world beyond the tree line. Investigations were real, not just headlines. A committee room in Washington had filled with names Jack never thought would need to answer hard questions. There were transcripts of statements and closed-door sessions. There were letters of intent from offices that tended to avoid attention. Jack didn't kid himself. Systems move slowly, but they were moving, and the truth had a seat at the table. Other changes were closer to home. A thin envelope had arrived the previous week, the handwriting careful and a little hesitant. "Mr. Coleman, I'm Elijah's sister, Dana. We never knew what happened. I don't know how to say thank you properly, but I'm going to try anyway. I want you to know he would have liked you. He believed in people who got their hands dirty to do what's right. If it's all right, I'd like to visit that tree someday. Dana Reed." Jack kept the letter folded in his pocket as he worked, the paper softening with use. He had already written back. He told Dana she would always be welcome here.
He told her the plaque would be waiting. He told her about Max and the morning wind and the bench he was building out of cedar, so that when she came, she could sit and breathe and not feel like the truth had been carved into marble, because the truth was alive and it needed space to be visited, not merely observed. He had taken the dog tag to her as well, in person, in a quiet meeting arranged by Sarah. There were no cameras, no microphones, just a simple handoff and a longer silence after it. Dana held the tag with both hands, as if it might slip back into history if she loosened her grip. She wiped her eyes, then smiled the way people smile when grief and gratitude arrive at the same time. Back in the clearing, the air shifted. The wind picked up and then fell away. Jack could hear the distant tick of the cooling stovepipe at the cabin, a metallic heartbeat he had learned to trust. He closed his eyes and listened to the sounds that had once felt like a void. Branches rubbing in the high canopy, a woodpecker testing a trunk somewhere down the slope, Max's slow breath. For the first time in a very long time, the quiet didn't accuse him. It steadied him. He had spent decades obeying orders. He had done his best to be the dependable one, the guy who showed up, who didn't flinch, who kept the team moving. Somewhere along the way, he equated obedience with honor. But there, under a sky that didn't need anyone's permission, he understood the difference. Honor wasn't the absence of defiance. Sometimes it required it. That didn't make him a rebel. It made him a man who finally chose conscience over comfort. "You did good," Sarah said quietly, stepping up beside him. "You know that, right?" Jack kept his eyes on the plaque. "I did what should have been done 20 years ago. And doing it now still matters," she said. "Maybe it matters more." He could have argued. He didn't. Instead, he gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged a truth he could accept without self-congratulation. Max stood and leaned into his leg again, and Jack gave the dog a scratch behind the ear. They stood like that a while, 3 figures, 1 memory, and a tree that had been transformed from a hiding place into a promise kept. In the months to come, there would be more phone calls, more requests for comment, more letters like Dana's, and a few that were harder to read. Jack understood that people carry history differently. Some resented the disruption, some welcomed the reckoning. Most fell somewhere in the human middle, scared, curious, hopeful, unsure. He didn't judge. He didn't lecture. He kept stacking wood, fixing the fence, and answering what he could. When asked what he wanted out of all this, he had learned to keep it simple. Respect for the truth and a name remembered. He turned back to the cabin as the sun found a gap in the clouds and flooded the clearing with a warmer gold. Sarah gathered her things, promising to send an update when the next hearing date was set. She touched the plaque lightly with her fingertips as she passed, like a silent vow to keep the story honest. On the porch, Jack paused and looked over one more time. The oak looked older and gentler in the light. Not innocent, trees don't forget, but absolved of its duty to hide. The ground around it was neat, the soil mounded with care. He had placed wildflowers along the edge because they were simple, resilient things, and because Elijah Reed had been, in the end, exactly that. Max barked once, a soft, almost conversational sound, and trotted to the threshold. Jack opened the door and let him in, then stood with his hand on the frame, feeling the worn wood under his palm. There was work to do, always would be, but today the work felt like living, not escaping, not enduring, living. He stepped into the cabin, then stopped, turned back, and lifted his gaze toward the sky. It wasn't a prayer, it wasn't a salute, it was a thank you. For the dog who wouldn't give up, for the man who dared to speak, and for the truth that, though buried, had risen, quietly, steadily, until it stood where anyone could see it. Jack breathed in and let the air go slowly. What settled inside him wasn't silence, but peace. The kind that comes not from forgetting, but from finally remembering everything you must not forget. The plaque caught the light, and the words shone just enough to be read from the porch. Sergeant Elijah Reed, truth never dies.